Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Eluge, the Shoreless Sea. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed from Skyfall, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but this price doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Eluge, the Shoreless Sea, is a legendary elemental fish costing 1 and 3 blue to cast, and has power and toughness equal to the number of islands you control. Also, whenever Eluge enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a flood counter on a target land, not limited to our own, which that land becomes an island in addition to its other types as long as it has that flood counter on it. Additionally, the first instant or sorcery spell that you cast each turn costs 1 blue or 1 generic mana less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. So, broad brush, Eluge is leaning on a spellslinging archetype with only a smattering of non-land permanents, trying to get a bunch of flood counters onto your land so that you can cast most of the spells in your hand with a heavily reduced cost while slowly growing Eluge. Thus for this deck, we're going to have a moderate focus on interaction spells, though not just counter spells, which should help keep our opponents in check and give us answers if they do try to deal with Eluge. And since we'll be swinging with Eluge with some frequency to get our flood counters, we may as well look to get a smattering of evasion granting spells, since actually achieving combat damage is nice over getting chump blocked. But given we can expect to reduce the amount of actual mana we pay for our first instant and sorcery by quite a bit, we can also rely on using some fairly high cost spells to impact the game. And for this deck, I decided to go on more of a theft dynamic, where we're just gonna straight up take our opponent's permanents for our own use. But that's enough of a preamble, let's get into the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp. First up is Wayfarer's Bauble, which can be sacked to tutor a basic land onto the battlefield tapped, which is extra handy as it gives us another island to bump up our commander's power and toughness. Then we have Mindstone and Prismatic Lens for generic producing mana rocks, Sky Diamond, Arcane Signet, and Decanter of Endless Water for blue producing mana rocks, with the Decanter also removing our hand size restriction. And then High Tide can make our islands doubly effective for a turn. And finally, Barrel, Chief of Compliance, and Haughty Djinn will reduce the cost of our instant and sorcery spells by 1 generic, with Barrel giving us the option to draw and discard a card whenever a spell or ability we control counters a spell, and Haughty Djinn being a flyer that has power equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in our graveyard. Now I'd like to talk over a few ways that we can get flood counters onto our lands faster than just swinging with Eluge. First up, we can use some flicker effects to get Eluge to ETB again, with Blur, Planar Incision, and Teferi's Time Twist letting you exile a target creature you control and return it to the battlefield, the first two doing so immediately, and the latter at the beginning of the next end step, with Blur having you draw a card, and the other two having you put a +1/+1 counter on the return permanent. Then Ghostly Flicker and Displace let you exile 2 target creatures you control, or artifacts or lands for Ghostly Flicker, which are immediately returned to the battlefield. Then the Flood of Mars puts a flood counter on a target creature or land, where on the land, it makes the land an island like Eluge's, but if put on a creature, that creature becomes a copy of the Flood of Mars. And finally, Aven Courier is a 1/1 flyer that, when it attacks, you can choose a counter on a permanent you control and put a counter of that kind onto a target permanent you control if it doesn't already have that kind of counter on it. So if you have a land with a flood counter on it and one without, Aven Courier can put a flood counter on the land without it. Now I'd like to talk over a handful of permanents that can help with filling out our board by frequently making creature tokens, which are specifically Murmuring Mystic, Talryn Sky Summoner, and Dika Fractal Theorist, each making a creature token whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. Murmuring Mystic makes a 1/1 flying bird, Talryn a 2/2 flying drake, and Dika makes a 0/0 fractal that enters with as many +1/+1 counters as the mana value of the instant or sorcery spell that made it, while Dika also has the ability to make a target creature token unblockable for the turn. But with that, let's go over the spells we can use to commandeer our opponent's permanents. First up we have Entrancing Melody, Dominate, and Blue Sun's Twilight, X-cost spells that have you gain control of a target creature with mana value X or less, though for Blue Sun's Twilight, you also make a token of that creature if X was 5 or greater. Then Invoke the Winds lets you gain control of a target artifact or creature, untapping it when you do. Ether Snatch lets you gain control of a target spell, so you could yoink an instant or sorcery for your own use, or a permanent while it's being cast. Tempted by the Auric lets you yoink 1 creature or a planeswalker with mana value 3 or less from each of your opponents, where Blatant Thievery lets you take 1 of any target permanent from each of your opponents. Mass Manipulation lets you gain control of X target creatures and or planeswalkers, and Subjugate the Hobbits lets you gain control of each non-commander creature with mana value 3 or less. And finally, while not exactly theft, Clone Legion and Elminster Simulacrum still felt somewhat in line with this chapter, as they make tokens of creatures our opponents control, the former cloning each creature a target player controls, and the latter making a copy of 1 target creature an opponent controls per opponent. Now I'd like to go over a few evasion spells that can help make it more likely that Eluge, or maybe something we took from an opponent, gets through on combat. First up, Aqueous Form, Slip Through Space, and Manifold Key each make, or can make, a creature unblockable. While Winged Boots gives its equipped creature flying and ward 4, at least making it expensive to deal with. And Fish Liver Oil is an aura that gives its creature Island Walk, so it can't be blocked by players controlling an island, of which Eluge can always put a flood counter on an opponent's land to ensure that they have one. But with that, let's move on to our draw spells to help keep our hands full. First up, since we're planning on casting a bunch of instant and sorcery spells, Archmage Emeritus and Wavebreak Hippocamp could give us a lot of draw throughout the game, the former having you draw whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, and the latter having you draw whenever you cast your first spell during an opponent's turn. Then Traverse Eternity has you draw cards equal to the highest mana value among historic permanents you control, so those are your legendary sagas and artifacts, so this will typically be 4 with Eluge out, while Flow of Ideas and Flow of Knowledge have you draw cards equal to the number of islands you control, though the former only has sorcery speed, and the latter is an instant, but you also discard a card. Then Mindspring and Finale of Revelation are X cost spells having you draw X cards, though unfortunately at sorcery speed. Finale of Revelation, however, can shuffle your graveyard back into your library and give you no max hand size for the rest of the game if X was 10 or greater, which isn't so crazy with Eluge's cost reduction. Then at instant speed, we have Pull from Tomorrow, drawing X and discarding 1, Stroke of Genius and Even the Score, simply drawing X, though Even the Score can get extra cost reduction if an opponent drew 4 or more cards that turn. Drown in Dreams lets you either draw X or have a target player mill double X, or we do both if we control our commander while casting the spell. Commander's Insight has you draw X, plus an additional card for each time you cast your commander from the command zone. And finally, Blue Sun Zenith lets you draw X while being shuffled back into your library to maybe appear again. Now let's quickly go over a pile of interaction spells to hopefully keep our opponents in check. First up, for our non-counter spells, Pongify lets us destroy a target creature, though its controller gets a 3/3 ape creature token in return, and Curse of the Swine exiles X target creatures, but those exiled creatures' controllers get a 2/2 boar token for each creature exiled this way. And then Aetherize returns all attacking creatures to their opponent's hand, especially great if someone is swung with a bunch of tokens, and Aether Gale lets you return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hand. But now we have a bunch of counter spells to go over, with counter spells simply countering a spell, Bane's Contingency also countering a spell, but you also scry 2 and draw a card if that spell had targeted your commander. Dissipate exiles the spell that it counters instead of it going into its owner's graveyard. And then Unwind counters a non-creature spell and Rewind any spell, but they also untap 3 and 4 lands respectively. Then Dissolve, Dismiss, and Dream Fracture counter any target spell and have you scry 1, draw a card, or have you and the controller of the counter spell draw a card, respectively. And then Saruman's Trickery and Access Denied counter a spell and give you bodies to work with. Saruman's Trickery making an Orc army with a +1/+1 counter on it, and Access Denied making as many 1/1 flyer Thopter tokens as the mana value of the spell that was countered. And finally, for, well, Blue's form of wipes, we have Engulf the Shore and Scourge of Fleets, the former returning all creatures with toughness less than or equal to the number of islands you control to their owner's hands, and Scourge of Fleets does the same, but doesn't affect our own creatures. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's look at our land base. First up, Myriad Landscape is a bit of ramp on land, as it can be sacked to tutor 2 basic lands onto the battlefield tapped. And Crystal Grotto and the Grey Havens are scry lands, letting you scry 1 when they enter the battlefield. Lonely Sandbar taps for blue, but is easy to cycle if we draw it when we're not really looking for another land. And Bonder's Enclave gives us a bit more access to draw, while Rogue's Passage can let us make a creature unblockable for the turn. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 29 basic islands. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for a bit under $44.50 at the time of recording, which is including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but wouldn't include costs such as shipping. But before closing out this video, I'd like to talk over a few potential upgrades to consider if you're wanting to upgrade or adapt this deck somewhat. So one of the major spell types that I didn't get into in this deck, mostly due to their financial cost, is extra turns, since blue actually has quite a lot of those. For relatively low financial costs, there's Walk with Eons, Beacon of Tomorrows, and Karn's Temporal Sundering, each giving an extra turn. Alrund's Epiphany makes 2 1/1 flying bird tokens along with the extra turn. And then there's Time Stretch, which gives the target player 2 extra turns. Then for a bit more cost, there's Temporal Mastery, which gives 1 extra turn, but it can be cast for its 2 mana miracle cost if you cast it after drawing it as your first drawn card that turn. Expropriate does both of the major things that I wanted to do with this deck, as it has each player vote time or money, starting with you, of which you get an additional turn for each time vote, and you get to take a target permanent from whoever voted for money. And Inundate and Spectral Deluge might be good to consider compared to our other board wipes, as they aren't going to affect our side of the board much at all. But it's due time I close out this video, so if you'd like to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you like the video, consider dropping it a like, and maybe consider dropping a sub if you'd like more budget commander decks in your feeds. But with that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.